Well, good afternoon. It's Wednesday here at St. Mary's, and this is the week before Palm Sunday. So we're anticipating Holy Week, and I'm going to focus on that today. But I'm going to talk, first of all, about a gentleman who was a master of music, and he lived about 500 years ago, Thomas Tallis. Now, Thomas was born in or around 1505. They're not quite sure exactly where. But at the time that he was born, England was in a great deal of turmoil. There was a lot going on at that time. And we don't know very much about anything about his childhood or very much about his life and his work until he is a young man who appears suddenly on the role of a priory in Dover. And in that location, he is working as an organist for a couple of years. Then he moves to another church called St. Mary at the Hill. And St. Mary's was a church where he was perhaps a singer and also an organist and was beginning his composing. He then moved to Waltham Abbey, and the abbey was dissolved in 1540. When the abbey was dissolved, he received no pension, but he did receive 20 shillings as salary and 20 shillings as a reward. I'm not quite sure what exactly that means, the scholars, but that's what he received. He then went to Canterbury Cathedral, where he worked for 2 years and then became a member of the Chapel Royal. One of the gentlemen of the Chapel Royal. It was a very distinguished and coveted position, and he worked there as a composer, as an organist, probably directing the music for many years, for over 40 years. At the time that he was there, he worked under the guidance and the rule of 4 different monarchs of England. The first one, we're going to see their pictures coming up. The first one being Henry VIII, and he was followed by Edward VI. Then we had Mary Tudor, and then Elizabeth I. And he worked through the reigns of 4 of these. He was a very obliging person because the monarchs were of different faiths. We first had Catholic and then Protestant, and then very Catholic and then Protestant. And he obligingly went along with their forms of liturgy, which made him a very facile and well-loved composer who kept his head. So literally. While he was there working first with Henry VIII, that was during the time of some of the greatest turmoil in English history regarding the church and society. And there was an act of parliament in 1534. They passed the Act of Supremacy. And this made Henry VIII the supreme head of the church. They separated from the authority of Rome. So at that point in time, they were a separate entity in terms of church organization and politics. However, worship style probably didn't change too much. Typical of the music of that time, up to that time, in this Tudor era, the music was mostly music of the church. There were simple songs that were happening in folk music, and the music of the church was where actual music development was taking place. Most of the things that were happening in the church were for the Catholic liturgy at that point. So they had mass settings, they had musical settings of the Magnificat, they had Vesper antiphons, all of which were very elaborate types of music. They were very melismatic, which means that a syllable could be projected over the course of many notes. The way we sing our carol at Christmas, Angels we have heard on high. When we get to the chorus, Gloria, it's spread out melismatically across many notes. So they were writing music which had these long melismas, many, many, many tones to a single syllable. This made for music that didn't have very good text understanding, but it made for magnificent music and the sound. And the effect of this was that it provided a wonderful meditative background to prayer and to every part of the liturgy. During Henry's time, when he became the supreme head of the church, and this parliamentary act came through, the Act of Supremacy, he also dissolved all of the religious orders, their houses. There were over 12,000 people in England at the time who were involved in monasteries or priories or abbeys or convents of one kind or another throughout the country, through England and through Wales and Ireland. So these people were suddenly out of house and home and out of work, and as it were, and many of the buildings themselves were damaged, some were destroyed, and some were left intact. A few years ago, when in England, I was visiting the city of Bath, Bath, and while there, I went to service at the Abbey in Bath. It's a magnificent building. If you would picture St. Mary's Church starting right on Luella Avenue, instead of being set back from Luella, starting at the curb or at the road and extending all the way through the far end of the church, at least over to the bank or the other side of the bank. That would be the length of the Abbey at Bath. However, this was only half of the church. The church was twice as long originally, but half of it was destroyed and torn down at the time of this disillusioning of the abbeys, which I think was probably very disillusioning for the people who were living there. It's a magnificent building still to this day, and wonderful music is sung there, and services in the worship. The prayers go on. The second monarch who was on the throne during Tallis' time was Edward VI. Edward was very much a Protestant, and he was absorbing the influence of the Protestant Reformation, which was taking place on the continent, particularly in Germany and that area. And in England, he insisted that they should get away from all aspects of Catholic and liturgy, worship and liturgy. And they were going around removing statues, smashing stained glass windows, whitewashing walls where there were beautiful paintings on the walls, and anything that had to do with the higher forms of art within worship was in disgrace at that point. Organs were vandalized, many times destroyed, and the priests were required to now turn and face the congregation. Normally, they would be behind a rood screen that was halfway down the length of the church, and they'd be facing the altar, up in the choir area where the monks would be sitting. Now they were required to turn around and face the congregation and to preach and to speak the liturgy in English, in the language of the people. During this time, there was an archbishop who was appointed a little later. After Edward's time, I must say, that Mary Tudor then came to the throne, and they were back to the Catholic worship. And then after her short reign, they had Elizabeth I, a remarkable individual, and she was very much in the Protestant Reformation of liturgy and of worship. And during half of her lifetime, Tallis worked as a part of the Chapel Royal. There was an archbishop who was appointed during that time, whose name was Archbishop Parker. And he served as a chaplain first to Anne Boleyn, and then later he was appointed Archbishop of Canterbury during that time. He composed a set of, he took the entire Psalter, all the Psalms of David, and put them in a metrical form so that they could be sung. He put them in English, and he reworked the words. Some of them sound very curious to our ears today. First of all, because some of the words, some of the medieval words, some of the ancient language of English, some of the things are not understandable, comprehensible to us today. But quite a remarkable achievement that he set all 150 psalms in metrical verse. He asked Thomas Tallis to give him some tunes to write that would go with these metrical verses. And Tallis wrote 8 tunes that each one was in a different mode. And I'll take just a moment to tell you what modes are about, just the surface. If I talked about it for very long, we would be here until late in Easter week. A mode is a gathering of notes which are put in a systematic way, and as you look at a keyboard, you see that it's divided between white notes and black notes. Well, if you can imagine a keyboard that had no black notes, only white notes, except for one particular note, B flat, would appear. And a B flat was used occasionally in some of the modes. But the modes were an accumulation of the notes that filled an octave span from one, what they called the ambius, to the finalis. And the ambient note would be the starting note. And the first mode was called Dorian. It's in the key of what we would say it starts on D. It sounded like this. That may sound pretty conventional. However, this is what we think of today as the D scale, either in major or in minor. And here is the scale as it is in the early days. So the first mode, there are 8 modes that were used for the church for the singing of plain chant. And these plain chants were not known by the names of the modes, Dorian, Phrygian, Lydian, etc., but they were known by the number. Tune 1, melody 1, melody 2, melody 3. Well, the third melody, which is called Phrygian, was used by Tallis. For a hymn, one of the tunes that he wrote, he set 8 of these tunes to the metrical psalms as an example of what could be done with all of, or any of the other psalms. So the third one in the series is referred to today as the third tune. It's become quite popular. It's used in many different hymnals, and we have it in our hymnal today, and it's hymn 170. But before we go to that hymn, I want you to see, did we see some pictures of the abbeys? That we can see them again. Okay. Going back to the abbeys that were dissolved, we have there a picture of Glastonbury, which is tradition have it is where King Arthur is buried. And then there is another one coming up. These are in ruins. Some of the churches retained their buildings, and they survived this whole period. But during this period, when Tallis was writing music for the church, he left the very florid style that was a signature of the Catholic liturgy, and he wrote syllabically. There would be one syllable for each note. And the reason for this is they wanted to have the intelligibility for people listening to the text. And the anthems became a kind of didactic sermon, a way of teaching music. And it was further emphasized by the fact that most of the anthems had a form of structure called A, B, B. You would hear a first part sung, then a second part, and then the second part is repeated. One of the anthems that we frequently sing at St. Mary's for our choir is, "If ye love me, keep my commandments." And it's constructed in that very structure. So, now going to one of the hymns in our hymnal that was written by Tallis. It's hymn 170, if you have a 1982 hymnal. And the text is, To mock your reign, O dearest Lord, they made a crown of thorns. This is in the third mode, the one that's called Phrygian, and the mode is one that is conducive to the solemnity of this text. We're going to hear this tune on Sunday here at St. Mary's. This is one of the hymns that we'll be singing. Let me play it for you. This tune might sound familiar to many of you because it was a tune that Vaughan Williams used as the basis for a fantasy that he wrote called Fantasy on a Theme of Talus. It's a very beautiful, beautiful piece written for the strings of the orchestra. Now, moving along to another hymn, we're going to go to a hymn that was a kind of folk hymn in America, and it's called What Wondrous Love Is This, O My Soul? And it's in a similar modal character. It's in the first mode, which is the Dorian mode. And it's interesting that the tune uses 7 of the 8 notes within an octave, and it never uses the third note of the scale. Here's the melody. It's a hymn that has an unusual meter, that is poetic feet, accents. If you count it, it's 6 feet, 6 more, 6, then 3, then 6, 6, 6, 6, 6, and then 3. And it actually works if you say all the words so you can count 1, 2, 3. What wondrous love is this, O my soul, etc., etc. This hymn, when it was first written, we don't know the exact origin of it. They considered that it's anonymous. There have been some reports that it might have been written by a Methodist minister from Oxford, Georgia. But the hymn first came to the surface around 1811. It was included in a collection of songs that was used at a revival camp meeting. We're going to see a picture of one of those events. There were many of them, particularly in the southern part of the country, but they were also spread out through the Midwest, the West, and even the Northeast of America. And this tune, or rather the words were known, but there wasn't a tune that was officially associated with it. People of the time sang whatever seemed to be a familiar tune that would fit with the words. And this was certainly a difficult one to put together, words. But you'll see here another of those tunes, or another photograph of that period. And what I'm going to do now is play one verse of the hymn as it would be played or sung. You'll hear the melody, the focus on the melody. When this hymn was first included in a songbook, it was in a collection from 1811, and it appeared in Lynchburg, Virginia, and at one of these camp meeting groups. And there you can see a photograph of one. I can't tell what they're singing from and what their books are, but there it is. In the format in which it originally appeared, it was written in shape notes. And sometime I hope we have a chance to talk about shape notes. It's a phenomena of American sort of folk-style music of the 19th century. And in this format, there would be a part for the sopranos, a part for the altos, a part for the tenors, and a part for basses. And they stood around in groups with their voice parts and sang. The tenor was where they placed the melody of this piece, interestingly enough, not in the top melody soprano the way we have in all of our books, hymn books today. But what I'm going to do is play two verses of this, and you will see that, or hear, the melody in the way we hear it in most places, most cases, actually in the soprano or the top melodic line. Here it is. Now you hear the other parts being sung, but here's a version with the melody in the tenor. Now, where did the tune come from? It was an Old English ballad that came from perhaps the 17th century, but in the 18th century, in 1701, it was a tune that was well known in England, also in America at that point. And it was the tune that was sung to it, or the words that were sung to it, was the Ballad of Captain Kidd. Now, you're going to see Captain Kidd coming up on the screen. Captain Kidd was a bona fide pirate. He started out with a nice portrait, and from there on he went downhill. But it was the custom at the time that if one could own a military ship, a man of war, a private citizen could own one, and they would act as a privateer. They would help the government. In this case, it was England. He was born in Scotland. And England and France were at war in the 1600s, and Captain Kidd was allowed to purchase one of these ships, and as a privateer, actually a pirate, he was able to attack other ships that were thought to be enemy ships, and then he would take the goods from that, and his wealth would be increased dramatically, and he would share it with the government. During the time that Captain Kidd was doing this privateering was outlawed. And then he became an outlaw, poor guy. And you can see He was not the most handsome fellow from the shot that you're seeing. But I wanted you to see that particular picture there. If we go back to it for just a second. This is an illustration from a book by an artist, an American artist. His name is Howard Pyle. And he did many books, Treasure Island, and I think The Last of the Mohicans, and other books in which he did illustrations. He was from the area of Wilmington, Delaware. So he's nearby. And in Delaware, in Wilmington, there is a museum that contains many, many of his illustrations. They're quite exciting to see. They're framed, hanging on the wall, and quite beautiful. The Ballad of Captain Kidd was the title of this tune that we've just heard. Here are the words. My name was Robert Kidd. For some reason, when this ballad came to America, the Americans changed the name from William Kidd to Captain Kidd. It's not known really why. But the ballad is, my name was Captain Kidd when I sailed, when I sailed. My name was Robert Kidd when I sailed. My name was Robert Kidd, God's laws I did forbid. So wickedly I did when I sailed, when I sailed. So wickedly I did when I sailed. And that is a worthy rendition, I'm sure. But it gives you the feeling of what the ballad was, and it worked with these beautiful words from the hymns, what wondrous love is this. Quite from the ridiculous to the sublime, I guess. Captain Kidd ended up on the skids that he was eventually caught and hung in England. Not only was he hung, his body was then hung at the opening of a harbor, wrapped in chains, and it hung there until it had just biologically deteriorated. So it was not a pretty sight. He came to an ignominious end. Now, having made that ignominious ending to that section, I'd like to move to another aspect of this time of the year. Today is the 24th of March. 9 months from tonight is Christmas Eve. Tomorrow, the 25th of March, is the day of observance of the Annunciation, when the angel Gabriel came to Mary and said, Hail Mary, you have found favor with God, and you are going to be the mother of a child. And we know that wonderful canticle that has evolved, and it actually came from the Old Testament. And it was something that Mary knew, and her expostulation, when she exploded into effect, her response to the angel was to go to this old, the scriptures that she knew. I think it's from Isaiah. And she said, my soul doth magnify God. And we know that a great deal. That's something that's sung a great deal in our liturgies. So we know it from a hymn, the angel Gabriel from heaven to Mary came. We're going to see a couple of pictures. I'll just play a verse. So that's a lovely hymn that we sing in Advent that talks about the coming of the Christ child. There were some very elaborate settings of this which have been written for choirs, choral versions, some of which are some of the most magnificent music coming out of choral music. We have a couple of hymn versions of this, a paraphrase in our hymnal of number 437 and 438. It's the same words, but there are two different tunes. I'm going to play number 437 first, and then you'll see 438 coming up on the screen. Here is the tune to Tell Out My Soul, the Greatness of the Lord. Here is the first version of it. We've sung that here on various occasions at St. Mary's. Now here's the second tune, which is one that I think we should bring into our repertoire of singing. It has a lot more get up and go. Listen to this. So that's a paraphrase of the Magnificat. My soul doth magnify the Lord. Another version of it appears in the hymnal Levis, Lift Every Voice and Sing. And it's a very short hymn. It's actually not the Magnificat. It's so short it's abbreviated to Hail Mary, O Mother, Hail Mary. It's the opening greeting from Gabriel to the young girl Mary. This is from Africa. It's an Africa folk tune and a folk melody. It's, I think, a very charming piece, and that's going to come up on the screen. It may be there on its way already. It's, by the way, in the language, the Salamu Maria I Mama, Salalu Maria I Mama, or words to that effect. I can't account for the pronunciation. Here's how it starts. It would be nice with some drums. Play it again, just so you can hear it and sing along, hopefully. It starts with a little rest, which would probably be a drum. Very gentle, very simple. I can hear it being sung perhaps under a tree near a thatched hut and somewhere in a rural area or in a more contemporary setting. It's quite lovely. Now, there was another tune that is associated with the Magnificat that's very, very old. It goes back possibly 1,000 or more years, and we're not sure of its exact derivation. But it's a tune that's referred to as the tonus peregrinus, the tune of the wanderers or the wandering tune. It's an interesting, brief melody. It came from a chant that doesn't fit exactly where most chant fits in the different modal scales, because it has two halves that are slightly asymmetrical. But it's a tune that was very familiar to people for hundreds and hundreds of years. And it's one that was used by pilgrims when they were making a spiritual pilgrimage. People would travel by foot from wherever they lived in Europe to the Holy Land if they had the resources to go that far. And that was a commitment of usually a couple of years of experience. And more locally, in staying in, there were various areas of pilgrimage within the countries of Europe. But one of the most popular was a magnificent church in Spain called Santiago de Compostela. It's very famous for many reasons. First of all, pilgrims went there. It was a place of spiritual retreat. You can see that it's a magnificent building still today, and it goes back many, many hundreds of years. It was a place where they went as their final destination for the pilgrimage. One of the things, as people walked, they walked throughout hundreds and hundreds of miles through Europe to make these pilgrimages. When they were en route to these destinations, one of the tunes that they sang most often was this tune, which are the words of "My soul doth magnify the Lord." And the tune sounds like this. And it was sung in Latin or in the various languages that the people knew. Another thing that was associated with these experiences, particularly when they were going to the church of Santiago, that's St. James in Compostela, the shell of a scallop shell is an item that became identified with these experiences. It was partially an identification of hospitality. People would scoop up and they would get water. But the shells are associated historically with St. James. So in some of the decorations at the cathedral, when you look closely and even from afar, you can see that scallop shells figure quite a bit in the decoration of the building. There is also a chorale version, a hymn version of this that was sung, and particularly in Germany. It was in the Lutheran tradition. They sang, so that was a hymn that was well known to the people of Germany. During the time of Bach's music, when he was living and composing, it was a tune that he used several times in various forms. He used it in a great choral work that he wrote called the Magnificat, which was the setting of the text of the Magnificat. But he also did a cantata, which contained phrases and parts of the Magnificat. And in one particular cantata that it was using this, he wrote a duet for tenor and alto. And it had an accompaniment of cello playing the bass line, the organ playing quietly on flute stops, and the alto and the bass were singing the part of the text that speaks of, and he looked with mercy on those, his children. And in the German, it's denket, and mit Erbarmlichkeit. In that phrase, you can hear the phrase in the music, the way the accents falls. Denket means he thinks. And that's the part that the tenor starts singing, and then the alto is singing. The cello is playing a bass line that matches that. And then he has the oboes in the orchestra start playing this old tonus peregrinus, etc. I'm going to play a version of it that he made a transcription of this choral, the part for orchestra and choir and solo singers. He made it into an organ piece, all played all by itself, and taking all of the parts. And this is it. With my feet, I'm going to be playing the part that the cello plays. With my left hand and my right hand on various times, I will play the part of the tenor singer and the alto singer. And you can hear that phrase, Danke, he thinks with mercy upon his children. So it follows the accent of the words in the German language. Then you will hear the tonus peregrinus coming in the middle of it. So here's how that little piece sounds, that as he made his organ transcription for it. and I hear the bells ringing, which means that we're at the end. I've talked too much, but I have one closing piece I want to play to prepare us for this coming Sunday. It's an old tune known to many. It was written by a fellow by the name of Jean-Baptiste Fauré. Jean-Baptiste Fauré was not related to Gabriel Fauré, who wrote the wonderful Requiem and other beautiful, beautiful music. But he was well known as a baritone. He sang in the opera at Paris Opera. He sang at the London Royal Opera House and all over Europe, and was quite an individual. He had a beautiful home, a villa, that was near a city in France called Étretat, and there are famous cliffs there. And he was also friends with many of the Impressionist painters, particularly Claude Monet and Edouard Manet. And he had commissioned Claude Monet to paint the cliffs of the area near his house 40 times, 40 different paintings related to that. And you'll see a picture in just a minute of, I think you might, no you won't, but you're going to hear some music that he wrote, even though you don't see the picture. And this is a tune that's familiar to many people who have sung it over the years, and it's called The Palms, and it's about the Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem. It sings, Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. And I will leave you with that thought, and here is the beginning of the piece. Thank you for joining us. Now I'll be ready for evening prayer.
And I'll just note all the people thanking you, Gordon, for what a wonderful, wonderful series that you've offered us and how much knowledge you have and you shared with us. It's resounding out here on the internet, people singing your praises. Thank you, thank you.
It's been a privilege. Thank you.
For those staying for evening prayer, it'll take me 1 or 2 minutes to get things turned around, so stay tuned.